My guest today is Dr. Jeff Childers. Jeff is in the College of Biblical Studies and is the holder of the Carmichael-Walling Chair of New Testament and Early Christian Studies. Jeff, it's a pleasure to have you here. Now, let's start with about where the New Testament ends, somewhere in there. What in the world happened?
It's good to be here, Royce. At the end of the New Testament period, I think one of the most remarkable things about the early Christian movement is how tiny it was. It consisted of really very few churches in a few places in the Roman Empire, and the communities were very, very small. And for the next 200 years, they barely left any trace on the historical record outside their own Christian materials.
So we tend to lionize them and exaggerate the movement because we're so familiar with it, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. They were a movement on the margins in a lot of ways, and very small, and yet they attracted followers. The gospel of Jesus Christ appealed to people of all types: rich people, poor people, women, slaves, Greco-Roman pagans, Jews, God-fearers, and slowly but steadily, the Christian communities in places that the apostles had founded them grew until they were 20s and 40s and hundreds, and even in a few instances maybe over 1,000, like in the city of Rome. So that by the time we get to the 3rd century, the Christian church consists of many thousands of people across the Greco-Roman world.
Now, what happened in terms of persecution? We hear quite a bit about persecution. What happened in that time period in terms of persecution?
Well, one of the most important events in the history of the early church happened in the year 250, when the Emperor Decius made it a matter of imperial policy to repress Christians. There had been persecutions before that, but they were very sporadic and one-off kinds of overflowing of tensions and suspicions in local places as a result of mob violence. I think one of the common misconceptions about the early church is that every Christian was under a lot of pressure all of the time because of the persecutions. That's not really true. Persecutions did happen in the first 200 years of Christianity, and they were very intense when they did, and they were very uncomfortable for the people who experienced them. But they were rare and sporadic because, by and large, people ignored the early Christian movement as it was growing until the middle of the 3rd century.
A lot of people are curious about what happened in the 2nd century because it was right after the end of the New Testament. So what was happening in the Christian community in the 2nd century?
You can imagine what it was like when the apostles began dying off, and the people who knew the apostles and were eyewitnesses of Jesus and the people closest to him were passing away. People were asking the question, who are we? What do we believe? How do we practice? And there were different points of view about that. And consequently, in the 2nd century, there was a lot of energy in the Christian church being spent trying to come to an understanding of what it was exactly that the apostles had taught, what they wanted us to remember about Jesus, what the most important beliefs were, the most important practices, how leadership would work in the church. And so in that 2nd century especially, there were 3 things in particular that developed. The New Testament canon, which took 150 or 200 years to develop, and it preserved the teaching of the apostles and basically said, here's what's important about what Jesus said and who he was. And then there were also statements of faith. I mean, not everyone had Bibles, and one of the things that early Christians did was commit to memory the most important features of their belief and practice. And these early statements of faith or creeds helped people understand what it was that they believed and what they were signing on to when they became Christians. They would memorize them, they would recite them in worship, you would be quizzed over it at baptism, that sort of thing. Yeah. And the other thing that developed that was really important was a kind of leadership. The bishop, the role of the bishop as the gifted teacher and leader, the cheerleader over against persecution and social pressure, the person who would take responsibility for making sure that things were being taught in the way that the fathers before them had handed down. So those three items, the New Testament canon and statements of faith, and bishops in churches, developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to help solidify Christian identity.
What happened in terms of the evolution of the bishops? Did they, I assume, collect around larger population areas?
Early on, churches, again, were very small, and a city like Antioch or Rome or Ephesus would have a number of small house churches, meeting basically as cell groups in the city. But they thought of the church in the city as being one church. It's the Church of Rome or the Church of Antioch. And by the middle of the 2nd century, most of these Christian communities were operating under a single bishop, what's called a monepiscopacy or a monarchical bishop. Early on in Christianity, it looks as though most churches had a committee or a council of elders, like the synagogues had had. These presbyters took responsibility for leadership. But in the 2nd century, there developed a singular bishop over churches. And I think the reasons are multiple. This was a kind of leadership that people understood in the world, a sort of top-down leadership, in the empire from the emperor down.
Right.
So it was a normal way of understanding how power would work. And also, there were people they recognized as being particularly gifted at teaching and pastoral care. Conflict resolution was probably the single biggest thing that bishops had to deal with, apart from simply teaching. So that became a standard way of organizing churches in the 2nd century.
I would imagine, though, also it was a hedge against heresy. Somebody had to define orthodoxy, and somebody had to define heresy. So does that play into that 2nd century formation as well?
Yeah, it does. I think a couple of the big pressures that church leaders felt were the pressures of the secular society around them, or the pagan society around them, and the occasional persecutions that would come with that, and the suspicions and so on. So it was important to have leaders who could respond to that, who would be good examples in the face of that. But also the pressures of diverse beliefs amongst people who claimed to follow Jesus. Some who said, we can buy that Jesus is human, but I don't think that he was divine. Or vice versa, or any number of other points of view about Christian belief. And one of the ways of dealing with that was to entrust a single leader who was responsible for teaching and making sure that the apostolic tradition was conveyed from generation to generation, could do it. It was easier for one person to do it than for a committee to do it.
How about the role of apologists in the 2nd century? What function did they serve in the church?
Christians, because they were such a small minority, and because they represented a strange subculture, they sort of functioned like an extended family would function. And in the church, there were slaves and masters, there were women and rich people and poor people and all sorts of people. People were very suspicious of Christians, and most of all, they were suspicious of the fact that Christians would not worship any of the other gods, the gods of Rome, the gods of mystery religions from the East. And so they were accused of being atheists, in fact, because they wouldn't honor these gods. There were other kinds of suspicions that arose too, that Christians were eating the flesh and drinking the blood of someone, for instance. And what was up with all these holy kisses they kept exchanging? And so sometimes Christian groups would be accused of sexual immorality. Consequently, there developed a tradition of responding to those kinds of suspicions, some of which were just rumors on the street about Christians, but some of which were sophisticated attacks against Christianity and Judaism on the part of pagan intellectuals. The apologists were a group of Christians who responded to those kinds of objections, clearing up any confusions that people may have had about what Christians did and what they were up to, but also trying to commend the faith as a superior set of beliefs and practices. And often they emphasized that they were people who prayed for the emperor and prayed for the life and vitality of the empire. They were not enemies of the state, but they would only worship one God, in Jesus.
How about in the coming of Constantine? Everybody's heard about him, and quite a controversial historical figure, but nevertheless a towering figure in Christian history, regardless of what you think of him, and his so-called conversion. Talk a little bit about how Christianity became respectable and embraced by the state and by the culture.
By the middle of the 3rd century, around 250, when Decius started a systematic empire-wide persecution, it was obvious that Christianity was a major force to be dealt with in the empire. Churches had grown very large, and there were significant communities of faith in many cities of the empire, and also into the Persian Empire as well. Consequently, emperors began taking notice of Christianity, and people like Decius, Diocletian, and Galerius in the latter half of the 3rd century tried to persecute Christianity for the purposes of eliminating it. But it continued to grow, and one of the things that happened in the political disarray of the turn to the 4th century is that one young military leader named Constantine decided that he would hitch his wagon to the rising star of Christianity. And he's one of the most controversial figures of church history. People debate whether he did it out of true piety or he was simply an opportunist. And one of the common misconceptions I hear sometimes in popular understandings of this is that Constantine made Christianity what it was. And that's not really true. Okay. Christianity had become a massively successful, dynamic, and vital force long before Constantine's time. That's why people were trying to persecute it. And that's why Constantine tried to leverage it for his own purposes. He didn't make it what it was. It had already become something. But in 313, in the Edict of Milan, Constantine officially ended the persecutions of Christians. He sort of converted to Christianity. There's a lot of debate about that. He wasn't actually baptized until the end of his life. But he did start favoring Christianity. He gave them big buildings to meet in. He gave Christian leaders tax breaks. He commissioned copies of the Bibles to be made. And as a result, Christianity became a part of the social mainstream in the 4th century.
And that produced various reactions, did it not, of the Christians? Not everybody was cheering.
No, that's right. Some people were very frustrated with state involvement in church affairs. And I think about a group that comes to be known as the Donatists in North Africa. But also, there were people who took note of the fact that Christian discipleship calls us to high standards of sacrifice and renunciation and even suffering. But in this new world, that was less likely to happen for the average Christian. And so a movement known as the ascetic movement or the monastic movement really took root. It had always been around. Jesus was an ascetic, John the Baptist, Paul, the widows of 1 Timothy 5, and so on and so forth. But it really got traction in the 4th century, partly as a reaction to the mainstreaming of Christianity. Groups of people retreated into the desert, where they separated themselves from the social mainstream, eschewing privilege and power and wealth for the sake of pursuing a more rigorous life of discipleship.
Well, also in this period are councils. We hear about ecumenical councils, Nicaea, Constantinople, and others that followed. What was the controversy? Can you kind of boil it down? What was the real issue that the church was trying to settle?
Well, the church had been entrusted with some very mysterious teachings from a really early time. Christians believed that Jesus' life and work somehow brought God to the world. They tried to sort of grapple with what that meant. Somehow God is in Jesus' person and work. And you see this really early on in the New Testament and in early Christian writings. But what does that mean? What does that look like? And over the next few centuries, Christians wrestled with those mysteries. Now, Christians inherited from Jews a particular habit, and that is when they want to know what the will of God is, they argue about it. And this is part and parcel of how Christian theology works. You argue about things.
Still true today.
It's still true today. We see it in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Jesus did it with his disciples and the Jewish leaders, Acts 15 and so on. It's the way it works. And for centuries, Christians and people outside the church who represented maybe deviant forms of belief argued about how divine Jesus was, how human he was, how involved God was in the world. And that's what these Christological or theological debates were about. They came to a head in 325 when Constantine called a meeting because of debates that were heating up and had been going on for a long time, and asked the church leaders to resolve the issue. And that's the Council of Nicaea. It's very famous. And they devised a statement of faith that many people in all parts of the world still adhere to today, that confesses the full divinity and full humanity of Jesus. There were several ecumenical councils and different statements of faith that came out of those. I think one thing that people are often confused about has to do with the function of those creeds, that the purpose of them was to constrain people's beliefs. But in fact, by and large, what they were doing was trying to guard against overreactions and extremes. In one way, heresy can be defined as the overemphasis of one truth at the expense of all the other truths. And that's what was happening in heresies of the early church. And so the creeds helped to provide some parameters against those who wanted to offer very extreme versions of the faith. So they weren't constraining belief. Instead, they were creating parameters within which a variety of understandings of the nature of Jesus and God could exist, and trying to protect Christians against those who were very, very narrow, like the Gnostics, or like the Marcionites, or like adoptionists, whose beliefs were actually very narrow.
That's the first of, I suppose, 6 or 7 what is called ecumenical councils of that the early centuries of the church. Finally, talk just a little bit about the towering theological figure, I would say, of the late 4th century, early 5th, Augustine or Augustine, take your pick. What is his contribution at the time and then later to us today? What is his significance?
In the 4th and the 5th centuries, one of the benefits of the peace of the church, as it's called, is that there were a number of men and some women who were able to devote a good bit of time to reflecting on the nature of God and Christian practice. And these church fathers and mothers, as we call them, left behind a lot of writings that are very important. Augustine of Hippo is one of the most influential. He wrote in Latin, and he had a lot of influence in the Western Church, even up until today. He was a brilliant intellectual who had a hard time buying the faith of his mother as a child, lived a wild and woolly life, but eventually, partly because he met some intellectuals who were also Christians, and they showed him that you could be brilliant and still believe these things and practice them. He converted to Christianity and then devoted his life to becoming a church leader, a bishop in North Africa. He wrote sermons, he wrote commentaries, he wrote letters, he wrote theological essays, and as a person who was grappling with a lot of the biggest questions of his day, and there were so many big questions: the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, the nature of the church in the world, who is God, what is the Trinity, why do human beings sin, and questions like this. Augustine brilliantly grappled with those questions, reading Scripture and trying to bring Scripture and the Christian tradition to bear on those questions. His answers and his discussions were so deep and far-reaching that they continue to be copied and learned and rehearsed for many, many centuries, and they've had a big influence.
Both in the Catholic and in Protestant traditions.
That's right.
That's really interesting.
Doctrines like original sin, predestination, concerns about sexual activity as the way that evil gets procreated in the world, these kinds of things that the Western Christian tradition has inherited came through Augustine.
Jeff, you've given us some really great insights into the early centuries of Christianity. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.